Blessings. Good evening. We have just a couple of questions have come in this week, so we'll endeavour to answer them. First question. Is the practice of the 4 Brahma-viharas a meditation or a reflection or both? So, first of all, the 4 Brahma-viharas are what we call the sublime abidings or dwelling place of Brahma. Brahma can mean a Brahma God, being who's attained jhana and reborn as a Brahma God. And there's 4 of these qualities that are considered sublime or divine. They make your mind divine. So that's metta, goodwill, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, upekkha, equanimity. So traditionally they are taught as meditation objects that one develops, focuses awareness, makes the mind pay attention, trains the mind to pay attention to one of those objects. You practice one at a time. But actually they're very closely linked. So if, for example, like most people begin cultivating the meditation of metta, goodwill, as we chant, we say, Ahang Sukhito Homi, may I be well, free from suffering. Sapphe Sattha Sukhita Hontu, may all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy. You begin with yourself and then you move out to other beings around you and then ultimately to all beings. Focusing your mind on that object. But out of the object of metta, then these other 3 qualities, because they're so closely related, they kind of emerge out of metta, or they're almost nourished by the metta, even though strictly speaking, when you're practicing metta, you just focus your mind on the one single object. You could say a result of that is that one becomes more sensitive to other people. So then compassion grows in one's consciousness, the awareness that oneself or others are suffering and the wish to overcome that suffering. Or mudita, the wish for oneself to maintain and develop any success and happiness, or the wish for others to maintain their happiness and develop it. And even equanimity comes out of metta, because in the course of our life and our practice, of course, we face obstacles, painful karmic results from our past actions can come up, or the people we love or know become caught into suffering, and we have to accept that. Having made some negative karma in the past, we have to experience the results of that. So we practice equanimity, or even equanimity when we experience the fruits of our good karma, so that we don't get lost, create a self or conceit out of our successes and the happiness we achieve, but maintain our equanimity. So these 4 objects are individual meditations, but they're very closely related to each other. They support each other. But if one is focusing on metta, then one keeps that object in mind during a period of meditation. And it's both the thought, we say the aspiration, the wholesome aspiration, may I be well, may all beings be well, but is accompanied by positive emotional state, so that includes a feeling, pleasant feeling. So it's both a thought and then it's accompanied by a feeling, and the more you focus on that thought, the more that feeling becomes clear to you. So it relaxes you. You can't help but feel more relaxed, calm, have a sense of well-being when you're cultivating metta, if only briefly. So it's a package of human experience, goodwill. Some people think, well, I just recite this word, may I be well, or may all beings be well, and it doesn't seem very meaningful, which is understandable, especially in the beginning of our practice. But remember, you're cultivating the positive feeling as well. And in the beginning you may have a more discursive approach to this meditation, so you're thinking through what metta means to you, metta for yourself, goodwill for others, thinking it through. But then as your practice becomes more refined and you do it more often, maybe you reduce it down to just one word or one phrase that symbolizes metta for you. Or even some people just have one feeling. A feeling, for example, in your chest of goodwill, loving kindness. Some people develop it focusing on a light. So the light, visual image of light is like symbolizing loving kindness. These are just a few examples. But the idea is to develop metta until it's really strong, continuous, and ill will, aversion, anger can't enter the mind at that time because the power of the metta is so strong. That's why we meditate on it and develop it with mindfulness, to make it strong, continuous. So you could call it a mental skill. Or good mental health. When you cultivate metta, it keeps your own mind in a good space. And they've now even done research on it, and physically it helps your body deal with illness, disease, pain, suffering, aging, sickness, and so on. Stress as well. There are many physical and mental benefits for cultivating metta. And then the other three are the same. One focuses on the thought, the aspiration, so may I be free from suffering, and then may all beings be free from suffering. And then mudita is, may I maintain the happiness that I've achieved. May I not be parted from the success, the good fortune, the happiness I've achieved, and may others not be parted from their success and happiness. And equanimity is based on the understanding of karma. I am the owner of my karma, other beings, all beings are the owners of their karma. So whatever karma I've done, good or ill, I will have to receive the results of that. So it's an acceptance of the teaching of karma, the law of karma, cause and result, which does bring a certain peace to mind, even when we have to experience the fruits of our negative karma from our past unskillful actions. If one can see it as karma rather than falling into depression or blaming oneself or creating extra stress and suffering around the karma that's manifesting, then we can maintain equanimity. And the same for when we experience the results of good karma. Just understanding, accepting that this comes from causes and conditions. But it is obviously, upekkha is a very subtle feeling as well as a thought, maintaining equanimity based on understanding of karma. It's also a feeling, that neutral, cool feeling of calm, neither pleasure nor pain, focusing on that. And the strongest experience of upekkha, equanimity, is fourth jhana. When one develops deep states of jhana, then one abandons even the pleasure, the piti and the sukha, the pleasure of states of samadhi, and just experiences pure equanimity. That's obviously a very advanced meditation, but one can still cultivate it as a beginner, cultivating this coolness of keeping the mind in the middle towards experience, whether the experience is pleasurable or painful, learning to keep the mind centered, even, balanced, equanimous towards the pleasures and pains of life. So all these four Brahmaviharas are meditations that can be developed, obviously one at a time, but one can interchange them from time to time, focus on one. There may be one that really resonates with you, you find it easier to develop than the others, you might focus on that. Or you might see a need to develop one in particular. Say if you're very jealous type, or develop a lot of mudita, if you're always competing, comparing with others. If you're a bit cold-hearted towards others, you notice that, or cultivate compassion, karuna, and so on. But they lead on to skillful action, obviously. They're combined with speech and action. So although we call them meditations, and they are meditations, they're also just wholesome aspirations, or skillful ways of thinking that we cultivate in all walks of life, all aspects of life. And if you have been meditating, say, on the theme of metta, then it will come out in how you relate to other people. You tend to be more tolerant, kinder towards others, more forgiving, and more compassionate, and so on. The more you cultivate these meditations, it will be a natural result of meditating on each of these themes, is that those qualities come out in your physical, or your physical actions and your mental behavior. Sometimes the meditations are difficult to develop. Sometimes it's hard to have metta, goodwill, especially if you're annoyed or angry with somebody, then it might be quite hard. So at that point we might just practice it on a more basic level, just being kind to someone or being tolerant of someone in a situation. Even if we have internally, we have anger in our mind, we can still learn to not follow that anger, the angry intention that may be coming up in the mind, but do the opposite and display kindness, tolerance, friendliness at a time when part of the mind is saying, no, don't do that. And this is part of the skill of the practitioner, is that learning how not to give in to your moods and your unskillful intentions and desires. And this is something the Buddha praised, this person who can manage their mental state so that even when anger or jealousy or cold-heartedness arise, the person recognizes them as unwholesome, unskillful, and consciously brings up the opposite, the kindness, the compassion, the sympathetic joy of mudita. And of course the Arahant, the one who's perfected this path, they can choose what they think. So they can still have metta even when facing someone who's very aggressive or unpleasant, loathsome kind of person or situation, or facing pain or facing difficulty. They can still bring up metta and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity because they've mastered their mind. But in the beginning we have to train ourselves, so that's on 3 levels, body, speech and mind. So training in the precepts is also cultivating the 4 Brahmaviharas. The precepts, when you put effort into recollecting your precepts, using them as guidelines in daily life, they will naturally require you to develop metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. Maybe something happens in your day, somebody else is unpleasant to you. You have to maintain your equanimity, or you may cultivate kindness and compassion towards that person, even though they're kind of hurting you or causing you trouble, and your first reaction may be one of aversion, ill will. But because you're training in the Buddhist path, you might let go of that anger and turn it into kindness and compassion. Maybe you focus on the suffering of that person. If they're behaving in a way that's unskillful, then you can contemplate that they're actually suffering and they're creating more suffering, more bad karma for themselves, even though you may be affected by their unskillful action. So not an easy practice, but it's something you can do. Sometimes you might be able to think it through in the very situation where you're being affected by someone else, and it helps you to let go of your own anger when you do cultivate compassion for them. So for myself, one of my first insights into this was not with people, but with animals in the forest, because some of those animals are aggressive or potentially lethal. They can hurt you, harm you. So I used to have anxiety, nervousness being in a forest when there's snakes, bears, tigers, those kind of things. But then reflecting on their life and their karma, all four of the Brahmavihara qualities came up over time, and instead of feeling afraid of animals that can hurt you, I just felt sorry for them because they're stuck in their animal realm and they're experiencing a lot of fear and suffering themselves. So instead of feeling anger or fear, I just felt compassion for them. And it's the same with people, isn't it? You meet people in the course of your life, and at first maybe they're threatening to you or cause you trouble, or they're just unpleasant to be with. But if you think through more deeply and you become more mindful in that situation, maybe your initial reaction of aversion may change into compassion, understanding. You become more sensitive to other life forms. And you also realize that if you follow thoughts and intentions of anger, hatred, you're hurting yourself, because they're conditioning your mind in a way that will bring you more suffering. Then it's not liberating to follow anger or hatred. Quite the opposite. It's bringing you to more suffering. Therefore, it's in your own interest to let go. Even when someone else is behaving badly, you let go, because you're looking after your own mind. And if you see someone else doing something not very good, you hear about them, you see them. That's one of the reflections as well. When you're more sensitive and you have more metta, more compassion, then you can reflect, well, do I have those qualities in me? And if you see the qualities are still there in yourself, then it's harder to get angry with someone else, because you realize I'm just the same, or I'm worse maybe. Sometimes we're worse than other people. So we practice the four Brahmaviharas on all levels, on the level of meditation, but then just cultivating right thought, samma sankappa, right aspirations, practicing generosity and kindness in daily life, through our speech, our actions, and so on so many levels you practice them, and they're very much a foundation of our practice, and they support the deepening of meditation, developing samadhi, and support the development of insight. They can help us to develop wisdom, because as you become more sensitive to your own suffering and the suffering of others, then you also see some of the commonality between yourself and others, and you realize the living beings have similar experiences. We all have a body, we have a mind, we feel pleasure and pain, we all want to be happy, we all hate suffering. And some of the attachment to self starts to drop away, even just when cultivating the 4 Brahma-viharas. The second question, Ajahn, is all attachment bad? There's another common point of discussion, isn't it, in Buddhist circles. We sort of develop this view, attachment is bad, it's all bad, so we hate attachment. So whenever we see attachment displaying itself in ourselves or others, we can get angry because of our attachments. And we see attachment as the enemy. We've got to get rid of all attachment. It's bad. So it's quite common to think like that. But you have to look a bit more deeply, don't you? Like, until we've developed our practice or matured our practice, we need to attach to certain things, identify with certain things to begin with, such as the Dhamma. You listen to the Dhamma to get information, get understanding of how to practice, what you're doing, why, what are the goals of the practice, what are the obstacles, what are the ways of practice that you're developing. We hear the Dhamma regularly, so you could call that an attachment, but in the beginning we need to have that attachment. We attach to the Buddha. So sometimes people say, I don't want any Buddha statues, I don't like that because it's an attachment. And it can certainly be that, but may simply be a skillful means to recollect the Buddha and the qualities of the Buddha as well. So it depends on your state of mind, doesn't it? But often in the beginning of our practice we have certain external symbols and practices and things that we do because they help to bring up skillful states of mind, such as faith, can even make us more mindful. So that you could say in the beginning we can attach to a certain amount of ritual and chanting and meditation techniques and Dhamma teachings and statues and certain things. And maybe we need that when we're beginning the practice, because if we had nothing at all, we'd be lost. We wouldn't know the purpose and the meaning of the practice and the direction of where we're going, perhaps. Very few people are kind of innately wise and just know what to do from day one. We need some of these externals to help us. So, you don't just drop or let go of Buddha Dhamma Sangha in the beginning, or Dhamma Vinaya. The original way the Buddha referred to his teaching is Dhamma Vinaya. And Vinaya refers to the external practice of morality and training in mindfulness. So we call that precepts, for example. We attach to the precepts, 5 precepts, 8 precepts, 227 precepts of a monk. But Ajahn Chah used to warn that, if you attach too tightly to these things, they become a cause of suffering. Even the good things that we use, the good methods and the precepts and the meditation techniques and the Dhamma reflections, if you attach too tightly, they can still cause pain. Just as you attach too tightly to anything, say you have a tool, if you hold on to it, grip it too tightly, that can hurt your hand. But if you hold it just right, and you make use of that tool to do a certain job, so you use a shovel to dig a hole, or you use a screwdriver to tighten something, when the job is over you put it down, you don't carry it and you don't squeeze it in your hand, well, you can use that tool. So many aspects of the practice are like that. In the beginning you attach to the discipline, the precepts, you attach to a meditation technique like mindfulness and breathing. You attach to all the concepts, the words of the Buddha and the concepts that you've heard and the ideas of the Dhamma practice. They're useful. But the teachers warn, attach, but don't attach so tightly that you're blinding yourself, and then it becomes blind attachment, and that causes suffering. So you have to review the kind of attachment you have, what you're attaching to and how tightly, even the good things you attach to. Or another problem, often we attach to people. We attach to someone who's a Dhamma friend, and we say, oh, this person has helped me and taught me or showed me the Dhamma, how to practice. They've helped me so much, and we cling to that person. And then if that person, something happens to them, it might cause us suffering. They may move away, or if it's a monastic, sometimes people cling so tightly that when if the monastic disrobes, say, that monk, that nun who was their teacher, falls away from Dhamma and disrobes, then because the person was attaching so tightly to them, once they're gone, then it's like their faith is shaken. Maybe the student gives up the practice when the teacher disrobes as well. It can happen. So we can attach, but don't attach so tightly that it causes suffering. And that's what we have to learn. That's the skill we learn through the practice. The word for attachment is upadana, which means clinging, attachment. It also means fuel. Fuel for the mind, fuel for rebirth. Because attachment leads on to more birth. It feeds more birth and more suffering. So technically there's 4 areas that we cling, we attach. So there's attachment to sensuality, gama upadana, so we attach to sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. And that can be good and bad, can't it? Pleasant or unpleasant. If you react with aversion to a sight, that you see something and it annoys you, angers you, that's the basis for more attachment. Just as if you see something you like and you delight in it, it's beautiful and attractive. Either way, it's a form of attachment. First there's craving, or really first there's unawareness, ignorance, which conditions craving, which is conditions clinging. So upadana or attachment is really the hardening or the deepening of craving. Craving may arise just for a moment, but clinging becomes something more deeper in your consciousness, conditioning you. And that's why it leads on to becoming and birth. So the first is clinging to sensuality, sense objects. Second is clinging to views. Views like, the world is eternal, the world is not eternal. When I die, there's nothing. When I die, there's more birth, there's a self, there's no self. All the different views we can have about things, what is right and wrong, good and bad. The cause of the suffering is the clinging. So it's still possible even to cling to views about Dhamma, what is right and wrong, true Dhamma and not. And that can still cause suffering. So just because you believe in Dhamma teachings or cling to Dhamma teachings is no guarantee yet of freeing yourself from suffering, because you may cling so hard that you're blinded. So why would that be? Well, maybe you cling to a view about something and then somebody else comes along and has a different view. What is right and wrong, good and bad. And then you get annoyed when they display their different view. Even the Buddha had to sort this out first before he was a Buddha, because he practiced the ascetic practices because that was the fashion for spiritual practitioners in India, and he fasted and went without sleep and pushed himself physically to the point where he almost died. And then he had a realization that he was clinging to a view that asceticism or austerities, austere practices will bring one to enlightenment. But Then he realized that was a wrong view, which led to wrong practice, wrong understanding. The opposite is clinging to views that say you just do what you want, indulge, eat, sing and be merry, which sounds good, and probably that's the prevalent view in the world these days because the world is quite well off. But it doesn't bring you anywhere near Nibbana. It actually brings you a lot of suffering and disappointment. But if you don't see it, you don't see the underlying view, you might not realize why you're suffering. The third kind of clinging or attachment is attachment to rites and rituals and external practices, different forms of conditioning. So like, again, you could cling to a certain practice and say, if I just keep practicing mindfulness of breathing every day, I'll get enlightened for sure. Of course, the point of practicing a meditation technique is to develop mindfulness, wisdom, and the factors of enlightenment. And you could be clinging to a certain practice, but not actually progressing in your development of mindfulness and wisdom. You just do it in a habitual way, in a kind of dull or routine way. Or we cling to all kinds of things, don't we? We cling to precepts, we cling to certain beliefs in the way we should do things, what we call cultural beliefs, cultural conditioning, what is right and wrong, good and bad. And they vary from group of people or country to country. And that's one way you can understand a bit more about your own cultural conditioning and attachment to external practices. When you travel or move between communities, sometimes you realize where you're attached, because it will bring up reactions in your mind if people have a different belief or a different way of doing things. The last and the hardest of all attachment is attachment to the idea and the sense of self. Attavada upadana, just interpreting everything as self, me, mine, myself. That pretty much covers everything. This body is me, a self. I am this body is me. The things I own are me, belong to me, my thoughts are me. Basically your 5 khandhas, seeing them all as self. And not seeing through that, not seeing the impermanent nature of self, not seeing the delusion of self because of the clinging. So it's a certain blindness of mind. So there's plenty to investigate when we look at attachment. And, in the big picture, I guess you could say attachment ultimately is, because it's a cause of suffering, it is all bad. But before you can get beyond attachment, you need to attach to the good things, the useful things first. So like the Buddha compared the practice to a raft to cross the ocean of suffering. And when you get to the other side, the land on the other side, where you don't need the raft anymore. But until you get there, you need the raft. So don't discard it too quickly. So we need the practices of sila, samadhi, panya, and various things that you might say are an attachment in the beginning, but they're part of the raft getting us across the ocean. When the time has come, you can let go. And one theme the Buddha had through his teachings is that we need to develop more refined kinds of happiness to let go of the coarser kinds of happiness. So why do we practice meditation? Well, you develop an inner peace and happiness the more you develop mindfulness, states of calm, and that allows you to let go of the attachment to sense objects, sensual happiness. You could say, well, the pleasure, the bliss of meditation is also an attachment, which it may be if you haven't reflected on it, seen it as not self, but it helps you to let go of the coarser kinds of attachment first. So as we climb up the mountain towards Nibbana, each step you rely on the previous step to get up the mountain a bit further, but then you let go of your your last step up the mountain and as you go on to the next step. Last question tonight. Should we make our goal to become a monastic? Well, some people would say that's an attachment. They say, oh, modern Buddhists don't need to become monks and nuns, you can just practice what the Buddha taught without that. So they see monasticism, becoming, shaving your head, putting robes on, living with this kind of discipline, whether you're a monk or a nun, they see that as out of date, old fashioned. Some people see it as attachment. They say that to us sometimes. They say, oh, you're just attached to all your rules and your way of doing things. So the modern Buddhists, sometimes they're very practicing non-attachment, living out in the world. And certainly you can practice what the Buddha taught out in the world. You don't have to be a monastic. And you can get some good results. Some people can become stream enterers, living in the world, keeping the 5 precepts, listening to the Dhamma, meditating, practicing generosity, cultivating insight. It's possible. Since the time of the Buddha, there have been those lay practitioners who have attained Margapala. But generally, the more you practice, the deeper you go in your practice, the more attractive the monastic life becomes. I mean, the monastic life can vary, can't it? You can live in a big monastery with many people, you can live in a small hermitage with just 1 or 2. But the seclusion, the discipline, the separation from a lot of the complexity and distraction of society becomes more attractive the further you train your mind, especially if you develop states of samadhi, insight. So it's just a natural, organic kind of, your mind will tend to gravitate more towards monasticism the deeper you go in the practice. But it's not absolute. So some people stay as lay people, and Buddhism is made up of monks, nuns, laymen, lay women. And there are plenty of good laymen, lay women in the world, and they perform an important role in their own practice and also supporting the monastic community. So there's a place for everyone, and you have to see what is suitable for you wherever you are at in your life. And you can't rush it. If some people have this idea, I should be a monk or a nun, and then they rush in and they're not ready for it, so then they bounce back and they can't sustain monasticism, they can't cope with the discipline or the renunciation, they find it too challenging, so they go back to the lay life, and often they feel very disappointed with themselves. So there's something to reflect on. You can be a good lay person as well, and maybe develop your meditation practice as a lay person, try to develop the precepts, right livelihood, right view in your daily lay life. Just see how you go, how you get on with that. Some people have particular responsibilities that make it hard to leave the lay life, such as looking after children or parents or a sick partner or somebody. Some people are very smart, they can almost maintain a monastic existence at home. So they don't wear the robes of a monk or a nun, but they keep very disciplined precepts, meditate every day, live very simply, use their time for practicing Dhamma. So it is possible, but it's just challenging in the world because there's so many distractions. If you ask me, the easy way is become a monastic. Cut out a lot of the superfluous, frivolous, distracting nature of life, and just live in a quiet place in the forest, in the countryside somewhere where you can meditate, you can keep precepts more easily, you can devote more of your time to the practice, assuming you have some support. But nowadays in the world there seem to be many kind people around willing to support monastics, so it's getting more and more possible for for people to try out the monastic life. But in the end, there's not one answer to this. You have to see what's suitable for you. Ajahn Chah used to talk about that old man, I forget his name, Paul Put. Anyway, he was an 8 preceptor who lived at Wat Pah Pong with Ajahn Chah, who came to the monastery, wore white, kept 8 precepts, shaved his head, and never once asked to become a monk. So Ajahn Chah just kept him there as an 8 preceptor layperson and praised him and said, oh, he's very wise and very peaceful, more peaceful than some of the monks. So just the number of precepts you keep is not a guarantee of wisdom or peace of mind. It can also, if that's your comfortable level for practice, you can be an 8 preceptor and attain great things. You can do a service for the community and just quietly meditate and practice. And there are, particularly in Buddhist countries like Thailand, there's many men and women who live as an 8 preceptor. They're not officially a monk or a nun, they're an 8 preceptor Buddhist practitioner, and they go very far in their practice. You could call them halfway. Maybe they leave home, stay in a monastery, keep the 8 precepts, meditate, live very simply, devote themselves to the Dhamma, but they don't take on full ordination. And sometimes they get very good results. I once went to Lumpur Ginari's monastery, who was one of Ajahn Chah's teachers, and his sister was there. She was 8 precept, wearing white, and she was believed to have attained jhana and was maybe an Aryapugala, Sotapanna. I believe she's passed away now, but at the time she was very peaceful, and I met her and talked to her, and she had a very radiant, peaceful countenance to her. So, in the end, it's the individual, how much effort they put into their practice, how well they discipline themselves, how well they negotiate or navigate the obstacles and the challenges of practicing in the modern world. So anyway, I wish you all success in your practice, wherever you are, whoever you are, monastic or laity, and we'll leave it there tonight.